Howdy again. It's Scotty Mac. I'm back to talk about L'Aventure Ambigüe by Cheikh Hamidou Kane. Last time I talked about why I think this book is worth talking about, why I think it connects, draws together many of the issues facing the West and issues facing West Africa. And so now I'm going to get into the passages that jumped out at me from the book and that I pulled from the book and then translated so that I could digest them out loud and get your thinking on them and think through them myself. So the beginning of the book, the very first chapter opens with Samba Diallobé at the Qur'anic school. He's been sent by his father to the town of the chief, his father's cousin. I should break this down into characters. Samba Diallobé is the young boy who's the protagonist, the main character in the novel. Then there is his father, who is called in this novel the Knight, le Chevalier, and he stands for Africans who think that the cost of sending their children to the French school outweighs the benefits. There is the chief, who is Samba Diallo's uncle and brother to his father, who is, of course, himself torn by the decision of where to send the kids, whether to tell his people to send their kids to the foreign school, because they are suffering materially, because they have been conquered and colonized by people who are, by all accounts, unfaithful to God in a lot of important ways as far as West African Islam is concerned. And then there is the Qur'anic schoolmaster. He is sort of the spiritual center, the spiritual paragon for the community and for Samba Diallo. And then finally, the chief has another cousin who is a female cousin who is essentially, she's the third of the trinity of power brokers, of decision makers among the Diallobé people. She's called the Great Royal, La Ronde Royale, and she is an imposing woman of wisdom and poise, and she represents the African decision maker who believes they have no choice but to send their children to the foreign school. So the book opens on Samba. I should fix the size of this screen. I'm sorry. Opens on Samba at the Quranic school, which this is kind of the picture to have in your mind for that. Boys with writing tablets memorizing the Quran in Arabic, word by word, to be able to recite it. The Quran is about 3/4 the length of the New Testament, and the most fundamental piece of West African Muslim boy's education is the capacity to recite it. And he must learn to recite it before he will at all be initiated into understanding the meaning of the words that he is reciting. And so in the first chapter, we get a sense of the relationship between the Quranic schoolmaster and Samba Diallo. Samba is, in many ways, his favorite student, is the schoolmaster's favorite student, although he doesn't want to admit it. And Samba in the first chapter makes a mistake in his recitation, and the Quranic teacher gets abusive towards him, pinches his ear to the point that it bleeds for making that mistake. And Samba, anyway, here's the first excerpt. The child succeeded in mastering his suffering. He repeated the phrase without flinching, calmly, steadily, as if unpierced by the pain. The teacher let go of his bleeding ear. Not one tear ran down the child's thin face. His voice was calm and his output measured. The word of God flowed, pure and limpid, from his burning lips. His aching head was buzzing. He contained in himself the totality of the world, the visible and the invisible, its past and its future. The word that he birthed in the pain was the architecture of the world, was the world itself. Samba Diallo's sense as, oh man, that's not what I want. Okay, my keyboard shortcuts have an influence on Ignore that. Samba has a sense of total participation in his early life with God and with nature, and is initiated into that in so many ways by the spiritual guidance and certainty of his Quranic training. To him, these words are magical. They are themselves the architecture of the world, and he experiences, senses in himself, a great unity with being itself, a great unity with God and with the world. Here's an excerpt that gives you some idea of the Quranic teacher who is initiating Samba Diallo into spiritual life. The teacher deeply believed that the worship of God was incompatible with any exaltation of oneself. Indeed, at the base of all nobility, that base is paganism. Nobility is the exaltation of man. Faith is, before all else, humility, if not humiliation. The teacher thought that man had no reason to exalt himself, save precisely in the worship of God. One interesting thing about reading this book is so often, finding myself more sympathetic with the traditional Islamic spirituality over against the French, Western, post-Enlightenment, secular, materialistic, scientific approach to life and experience. But just as Samba Diallo can't help later being transformed, being pulled away from his sense of unity with God and with the world by Western philosophy, so too, despite my intellectual and spiritual commitment to God in the Christian tradition, I am colonized, I am influenced inevitably by Enlightenment thinking, Enlightenment philosophy, modernism, postmodernism, deconstruction, all of these things. I might be getting ahead of myself with quotes, but you may find yourself far more sympathetic with the West African Islamic position than you are with a lot of what is put in place for Western philosophy. My point mainly with these passages is that religion and relationship to God and union with God and with being itself are the things that characterize Samba's early life and his religious formation. The trouble is, as a people, the Diallobé are suffering. They have been subjugated. They have been overcome. And so now we come to a conversation between the Quranic school teacher and with the chief himself, as they're both wrestling, the chief mainly, with whether to send his people to the French school. The chief asks, "Teacher, am I a sufficiently fixed landmark, a sufficiently stable recourse?" "You are." "So it is. I am the authority. Where I set myself, the earth seeds and hollows out under my weight. I become embedded, and men come to me. Teacher, they think I am a mountain. You are. I am a pitiful thing that trembles and knows not." "That's true. You are that as well." "Men come to me more and more. What should I tell them?" The teacher knew what the chief was going to talk to him about. The chief had brought up that subject with him 1,000 times. The Diallobé men wanted to learn to better bind wood to wood. This idiom, to better bind wood to wood, it is a Fula idiom for practical knowledge. Binding wood to wood is building a home, building a dwelling. And so the people's desire to better know wood to wood is to know technology, the things that make for life. They want to better know how to grow food, to feed themselves, to clothe themselves, to shelter themselves, to defend themselves. So better binding wood to wood is practical wisdom. The Diallobé men wanted to learn to better bind wood to wood. The land in mass had made the inverse decision to that of the teacher. While the teacher denied the rigidity of his joints, the weight of his kidneys, denied his hut, and recognized no reality but that toward which his thought flew off with delight at every instant, the Diallobé, a bit more each day, worried about the fragility of their dwellings, about the rickets of their bodies. The Diallobé wanted more weight. When his thoughts stumbled over that word, the teacher quivered. Wait! Everywhere he was running into wait. I interject again to make a comment. Weight is the notion of, essentially, when we have in English the idiom of throwing your weight around. Weight is influence. Weight is, you become the center of gravity. In the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, the word in Hebrew that's translated glory is the word for weightiness, heaviness. And so you can think of that as the Diallobé men wanted more weightiness. They're feeling emaciated. They're feeling light. They're feeling pushed around. And they're looking to have a little more stature when it comes to their situation, in relation to the colonial government, situation in relation to those who have arrived on the scene and absolutely dominated them. They want more glory. So, meanwhile, the teacher, he eschews that. The Diallobé, a bit more each day, worried about the fragility of their dwellings, about the rickets of their bodies. The Diallobé wanted more weight. When his thoughts stumbled over that word, the teacher quivered. Wait! Everywhere he was running into weight. When he wanted to pray, weight opposed it. The heavy cloak of his daily troubles upon the impetus of his thoughts toward God. The ever more sclerotic, inert mass of his body upon his will to stand up in the movements of prayer. There were also other aspects of weight that, just like the evil one, put on various faces. The disciples' distraction, the shining fairies of their young fantasies, so many hypostases of weight doggedly set on binding them to the ground, keeping them far from truth. Tell them they are squash. The teacher repressed a smile. Usually the mischief of his thought amused him. The chief waited, though, knowing from habit what stock must be placed in the venerable man's leaps. Squash has a strange nature, the teacher finally said. When it is young, its only vocation is to put on weight. Its only desire is that of being lovingly stuck to the earth. It finds its perfect fulfillment in weight. Then one day everything changes. The squash wants to fly off. It reabsorbs itself. It hollows itself out as much as it can. Its happiness is a function of its vacuity, of the resonance of its answer when a breath moves it. The squash is right in both cases. And again, I covered you guys up from the text. I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. I wanted to show you an image of an instrument called the balafon. Of course, the squash is a natural resource of Africa, and dried out squash becomes a gourd. After it is put on weight, like he says, squash hollows out. It becomes hollow, and when dried and cured and hardened well, it can be used for bottles. It can be used in this case as a musical instrument, where this xylophone gets its sonority, its sound, and its pitch from gourds that are placed under each paddle as they're struck. So, squash. Yes, squash. Its happiness is a function of its vacuity, of the resonance of its answer when a breath moves it. The squash is right in both cases. Teacher, where are the squashes of Diallobé? That's for the gardener to say, not me. The chief was silent for a moment. If I tell them to go to the new school, they will go en masse. They will learn all the ways of binding wood to wood that we don't know. But in learning, they will also forget. Is what they will learn worth more than what they will forget? I wanted to ask you, can one learn this without forgetting that? And is what one learns worth what he forgets? At the home, that is the place where the students, that is the Qur'anic school, where the students live with the teacher. At the home, what we teach kids is God. What they forget is themselves. It's their bodies and this propensity toward futile daydreaming which hardens with age and suffocates the spirit. So what they learn is worth infinitely more than what they forget. If I don't tell the Diallobé to go to the new school. They won't go. Their homes will fall into ruin. Their children will die or be reduced to slavery. Misery will settle into their homes, and their hearts will be full of resentment. Misery is, here below, the principal enemy of God. Nevertheless, teacher, if I understand rightly, misery is also the absence of weight. How can I give the Diallobé knowledge of the arts, and the use of weapons, and the possession of riches, and the health of the body, without making them heavy at the same time? Give them weight, my brother. Otherwise, I affirm that soon no one will remain in this country. The Diallobé count more deaths than births. Master, even you, your homes will be snuffed out. One of the causes of Samba Diallo's meaning crisis in this book is not simply his exposure to French philosophy, but is clearly the uncertainty, the loss for decision making, the loss of wisdom of both the chief and the Qur'anic schoolmaster. Often they are in scenes where they're having a discussion, lamenting their ignorance, lamenting the fact that they cannot make a decision in confidence. At one point, the whole community comes to the Qur'anic schoolmaster's house looking for wisdom, and he's at great pains to say, I know you've come to me for direction. I can't give it to you. And when the chief and when your spiritual leaders have no answers, don't know what to say, don't know how to direct the people, well, that is one of the sources of disillusionment, of disintegration that have been experienced by many West African communities, by many communities all around the world who were colonized and subjugated to the prophet of the West. And again, not exclusively. A lot of history is a history of conquering and colonizing, and there are very diverse and distinct experiences depending on the colonizer, and in many cases, particularly in English colonialism, many benefits have accrued even to the colonized. That's not to excuse things, but using and taking advantage of people is not the full story of colonialization, as is often pointed out by Cheikh Hamidou in his book. Well, at this point in the conversation, the chief's cousin, La Ronde Royale, comes into the conversation, and her position, as I mentioned, is that they have to send the kids to the school. The teacher has just said, kind of as a concession, you don't really have a choice. I'm not entirely for it, but you should send them to the foreign school so that at least we'll survive. The Ronde Royale's position is a bit more forceful than that. She says, 100 years ago, our grandfather, at the same time as all the other inhabitants of this nation, were awakened one morning by a clamor coming up from the river. He grabbed his rifle, and with all the elite fighters in tow, threw himself upon the newcomers. His heart was intrepid, and he attached a greater price to liberty than to life. Our grandfather and his elites were defeated. Why? How? Only the newcomers know. We must ask them. We must go learn from them the art of conquering without being in the right. That's the mystery. In much of the ancient world, the idea is, if someone has won, it's because God has given them victory. God has favored them with victory. So why have the keepers of right religion been defeated by infidels? And soundly. It wasn't even close. That's her question. We have to learn from them how to conquer without being in the right. Otherwise, we're just dominated for no reason. The teacher, in a different conversation, reflecting on Western dominance, says, is it perhaps better this way? If God has assured their victory over us, apparently we, his zealots, must have offended him. For a long time, the worshippers of God have governed the world. Did they do so according to his law? I don't know. I have heard that in the country of the whites, the revolt against misery is in no way distinguished from the revolt against God. Think of the French Revolution, of how the revolt against the monarchy, which stood for, among other things, religious traditionalism. The French Revolution revolted against misery, against hunger, against poverty, but also against the church, and set up, temples to humanist values, to man. I have heard that in the country of the whites, the revolt against misery is in no way distinguished from the revolt against God. They say that the movement is growing, and soon throughout the world the same great cry against misery will everywhere drown out the voice of the muezzin, the muezzins. I don't know what the pronunciation is in English. Those are those who in a minaret at the mosque call people to prayer 5 times a day. So the voice of misery will drown out the muezzins. How great must have been the fault of those who believe in God if at the end of their reign over the world, the name of God arouses the resentment of the hungry. This is one thing I appreciate about this sentiment, is that it's the instinct of many of the Hebrew prophets. If we're in trouble, it's because we screwed up. It's just. If in fact the poor around the world are running to Marxism, to turning the tables and taking in their own hands in the name of their own desires, and to the squashing of tradition and of God. I forgot how I started that sentence. But if that's the state of affairs, you can't but think, you can't but conclude that those who were governing in the name of God and claiming to represent him had failed deeply, had failed in important ways to do so according to God's law. And so the teacher is willing to see a certain justice in their current state of subjugation. I think that might be a stopping place, because I'm at 22 minutes, and the decision will be made. The decision is not ultimately even announced by the chief or the Qur'anic school teacher. La Grande Royale, the great royal, his cousin, calls the people together, and she communicates the decision that they will be sending their own children to school, and they expect to the French school, and that they expect the rest of the people to follow their example. And so the fact that the heads, the real heads, the chief and the Qur'anic schoolmaster, are not present for that reflects to the people, reflects in the whole culture, the tearing apart of the heads of their leaders, of their uncertainty, of their fragility. And one of the people who is very unhappy with this decision is the chief's other cousin, Samba Diallo's father, who receives a letter that his son is being sent back to him from the Qur'anic school, and he will be sent to the French school. He's not happy about it. So I'll open with that letter in the next video. I hope that you find this interesting, edifying, and after that, of course, we'll be into Samba Diallo's French education. We'll reflect a little bit more on his early years, but okay, rambling now. Till the next time.